Well, one of the things I love about vacation, especially when we go down to Hatteras, North Carolina, is it is an opportunity for a road trip. How many people here love road trips? Are road trippers? Okay, good. We got some people. Because I'll tell you, growing up, our family, we had some epic road trips. In fact, my sister's here. She can correct anything I get wrong. But anyway, but we had some great road trips, some epic road trips growing up. Each year we would drive out to Western Michigan. My mom had her best friend lived out in the middle of cornfields in Western Michigan. So we'd go out there every year. And and then every couple years we'd go on these family vacations where we would drive to places like Nashville and Niagara Falls, all along the Gulf states and down to Florida, and all these amazing trips. And each of these trips, as I look back, shared some common experiences that made them memorable. And I want to talk a little bit about that this morning. And the first thing that made these road trips memorable, and you might be able to relate, is that our road trips, we would always leave in the middle of the night. Did you ever do that? I mean, we're talking 3, 4 in the morning. We would load up the car and we would head out on these road trips. And really, there were a couple of advantages to this, and I saw that as I've gotten older and taken my own family on road trips. First was you could beat traffic. The earlier you left, you beat traffic. You get through Washington, D.C. and some of those places before traffic would start. But the other one, which was pretty cool, and I figured out with my dad, he would love to get us in the car where we'd still be sleeping so that he could have some time of peace to start the trip and make some good time getting on the roads. And so even today with Deb and the girls, when we go on long road trips, we leave as early as possible. In fact, yesterday, when we were coming back from North Carolina, we pulled out of the driveway of the house we rented at 4:30 in the morning. And it was awesome. That's something that I think we've always built like a memorable. And for me, it doesn't feel like a road trip if we don't leave well before the sun is up. Now, another lasting memory of these trips for me was how my brother, my sister, and I would usually be crammed together in the back of the car, wedged between each other, and suitcases and coolers, and sometimes other family members that would go along with us or friends. And it was kind of like we were Tetris pieces, you know. It would take a couple days after we'd arrive somewhere just to be able to straighten up again. But we'd always be kind of crammed in there, like up against windows. And me, as being the youngest, was always I was the last one to get put in. So we'd always remember this and be wedged in. And the third common memory of these road trips was that often our road trips were pretty long. We'd go a pretty long way on our road trips, which meant long hours in these cramped conditions getting to our destination. Can you relate to that? You remember some of those things on road trips? And for some of you, maybe you look at that and it's a negative. And you say, man, they seem like a torturous time and a waste of time, especially because a lot of these road trips, it'd be much quicker if we could fly. And we could just get there flying. Yet, for our family, we drove. And in thinking about some of these road trips, that felt like they were these never-ending times of waiting. And as I'm looking at some of these road trips and looking back on these things, and we're looking at this times of waiting to arrive where we're going and passing and just kind of passing through times, sometimes these journeys can often feel like how we think of our journey with God. We have this destination that we're confident that God has for us. For some of us, we say, well, God has for me a significant place of service, and I can't wait to get there. Some of us, it may be just a purpose that he has for us. Maybe it's family or being married or something like that, and we're like, all right, God, you have this for me. Let's get there. For others of us, it may be a fruitful walk with him filled with joy, impact, and intimacy. You ever feel like you're on a journey like that with God? And it sounds wonderful. So we load up our proverbial car and we hit the road headed for this destination God has for us. Yet, as we set out, we begin to realize that this journey is taking a lot longer than we thought it was going to take. And longer than expected, and there's detours, and there's changes of plans. And as we're sitting there saying, are we ever going to get there, God? Maybe our zeal for getting to our destination with God seems to start fading. Can you relate to that? And it starts fading, and we feel more like we're packed in the back of a station wagon watching mileposts go by, waiting and wandering. It's during times like this that, I don't know about you, but sometimes we can begin to fear that we're wasting our time with God, that we're wasting all this time following Jesus, and we may never arrive at where God has for us. And we start to fear that. Have you ever been there? Ever felt like that with your walk with God? And it can be discouraging, can't it? However, you know what? It doesn't have to be. In fact, as I started to think about that, and I was looking back at our family road trips crammed in the back of our Buena Vista. Remember the Buena Vista, Linda? Okay, she remembers that, yeah. We experienced something else that made these trips unforgettable. Sometimes even better than the actual destination. You see, our time traveling as we were going from where we set, from our plan to our destination, wasn't just spent sitting there looking longingly out the car window. Instead, we made the most of each of our trips. We would get to know each other. We'd hear stories about, my parents growing up and things like that. We'd tell funny stories. We'd play games. And best of all, we would go on side quests. Did you ever go on a side quest on a road trip? I'm telling my mom and I, we were side quest kings. We were the leaders of the family on side quests. And on these side quests, these side trips that we would go to on the road to things, sometimes we'd see things that we never would ever get a chance to see. Like SeaWorld in Ohio. Did you know there's that there used to be a SeaWorld in the middle of Ohio? And more than once, we drove miles out of our way to go see this SeaWorld in Ohio, only to find that it was closed for the day. I think 3 times we tried to go there, and it was always closed. Or maybe we'd go and we'd see the world's largest wicker store, which I'll tell you, for a 12-year-old boy, is the epitome of excitement, isn't it? Sometimes we travel miles out of the way to learn new things that we never knew before. Like when we would visit Civil War battlefields along the way, we'd see a sign for a Civil War battlefield, and we'd like, let's go! And we'd go and we'd learn all about history and things like that. Or we'd tour college football stadiums on our trips and just kind of break into them and walk around and see what was going on. Or the time where we learned how Frosted Flakes were made by going 3 hours out of our way to the Kellogg's factory. And we would learn new things that we could take with us. I'll never eat Frosted Flakes the same again. And we'd also, on these side trips, would experience danger and learn how to find our way when we were lost. Like the time we had to turn around on a 1-lane road, towing a trailer in the middle of Alligator Alley, where there were ditches with alligators on both sides. That was neat. Or the time where we ran out of gas in the middle of the Pennsylvania interstate, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, in a snowstorm. And you figure out, we had 1 candy bar. And you figure out how to survive. And those are things that you go through and you're like, wow, what things we learned. You see, the time between embarking on our journey and reaching our destination, it was never wasted. That time made our trips often and made getting to our destination that much more meaningful and fulfilling. Can you relate to that? Well, the same holds true in our journey with God. And also, really, for all those who walk with God. In fact, Scripture teaches us that our times of wandering and our times of waiting are never wasted. Rather, it's in those times that God often has the most to teach us, train us, and reveal to us about Himself. In fact, in the Old Testament, the events between the book of Exodus and the book of Joshua, when God's people leave slavery in Egypt and the time where they enter the promised land led by Joshua provides some of the most significant lessons of God's faithfulness during times where we feel like maybe we're just wandering and waiting for God to do something. These events are recorded in the books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In fact, this week we begin a brand new series through these 3 books of the Bible. And it's called Walking Through the Wilderness, as we're going to walk with the Israelites and God through the wilderness to see what He has for us on the journey. When oftentimes we can say, why are we stuck waiting, or why are we stuck wandering? Now, this morning, what I want to do is I want to set the stage for all of this. This morning kind of serves as an introduction. And what I want to do is I want to set the stage for this time of waiting, wandering, and God working so that we can grasp what the Israelites are facing, so that next week as we start Leviticus, we see their expectation of getting to their destination, the promised land that God had given them. And the expectant situation God's people found themselves in as they traveled from Egypt to this promised land. And a few years ago, we went through the book of Genesis and we went through the book of Exodus, and you can look back on some of our archives and go through them. And some of that I'm going to kind of retrace our steps so we can understand this journey and this plan God has for His people. And also why we can sometimes get impatient and why God's people would get impatient in the waiting. So let me take you on a journey real quick and a timeline to kind of give us some understanding in this. All right, it's Genesis chapter 12. In Genesis chapter 12, it's more than 2,000 years before Jesus would be born. And God calls a man named Abram, who He would change the name to Abraham. And He calls him, he's living in the land of Ur, which is where Babylon kind of was, just to kind of understand where that is, a little bit north and west of Babylon. But He calls this guy named Abraham, or Abram, and He gives him a promise, and He tells Abram to follow Him. And He says, because I want to bless you. I want to make your name great. I want to give you land that you can have. And I want to make out of you a great nation, even though his wife was barren and they both were old and had no kids. And best of all, He said, and all nations of the earth will be blessed through you. See, because through Abraham's line would come Jesus, who would bring salvation, the Messiah. So by faith, Abraham, he follows. And his journey is one of waiting and wandering as God sets this plan out. In fact, again, he doesn't even have a son. And God eventually gives him and his wife a son. And through that son, he then marries. And he has 2 sons. And his younger son is a man named Jacob. And that's who the blessing is going to go through. And Jacob would later be renamed Israel. So this son of blessing was Jacob, but he doesn't have a wife. So he goes off to the land of his uncle to go find a wife. And he finds a woman, he falls in love, and his uncle says, you need to wait. You need to wait and work for me for 7 years, and then you can have her. So he works for him for 7 years, and he gets married, and here the old switcheroo happens and gave the other daughter to Jacob. So then he has to wait and work another 7 years to have the right to marry Rachel, the woman that he loves. And through Rachel and Leah, they have sons. And they go back to this land that God had promised to Abram. And they begin to settle there. And he has 12 sons. And as they start to get older, there's a famine in the land. And they don't know how they're going to survive. But they hear that Egypt has food. And they need to go to Egypt. And one thing that happened in between the times, Jacob's one son that he loved the most was a guy named Joseph. And he thought Joseph had died. But really, his other sons were jealous, and they sold him into slavery into Egypt, where God blessed Joseph and made him like a prince there, or an assistant to the Pharaoh. And through Joseph, they readied themselves for this famine, so they had food, so that when Jacob and his family need to be rescued from this famine, they go to Egypt and they find that God had already provided. So they go to Egypt in this famine. Now, the year is about 1876 BC. So it's been a couple hundred years that this has happened. Already a couple hundred years of waiting. Now, while the people are in Egypt, God blesses his people. In fact, this family grows into a great people of 2 to 4 million people estimated. And as they grow and they're reproducing and all of this, the Egyptians, they get a little fearful of this, so they enslave these people, God's people, and they enslave them. And for 400 years, they serve as slaves in Egypt. More waiting, more wandering, until God says, all right, I am now going to lead my people back to the promised land. And he uses a man named Moses, and he raises up Moses, and God sends these plagues upon Egypt, and 10 plagues upon Egypt to show his power and his faithfulness to his people. And finally, his people are released, and they begin this journey to the promised land. Okay, so it's been over 600 years of already waiting. Now, this journey, and it's 1446 BC, thereabout. And this journey from Egypt to the promised land is about 400 miles. Okay? So for this 2 to 4 million people, it would take probably a year or two to make this journey. Now, it's interesting because as I was looking at the numbers and things, our journey from Hatteras, North Carolina home yesterday was 400 miles. It took us 9.5 hours. This journey that could have taken the Israelites 1 to 2 years was over 40 years. What was happening during that time of waiting and wandering? Well, the book of Exodus covers the first year of this journey as God shows, again, his faithfulness to his people. And he parts the Red Sea to lead the people through. And then he provides for them drinking water so they can survive in the desert. And he provides for them manna to eat. And then he brings them to the foot of a great mountain named Sinai. And God shares with them his heart. He gives them the 10 Commandments. And then during that time, he also shares with them his presence as he gives Moses instructions for erecting a tabernacle or God's presence among his people so that they could experience God's presence. And that's pretty much the first year of this journey. And it takes us through the book of Exodus. So here we stand now on the precipice of that. God's about to take them now from Mount Sinai, the rest of this journey to the promised land in Leviticus. And that's what we're going to start to look at next week as we cover that, as it's going to take over 40 years for them to go this relatively short distance. And so that's where we'll pick up, covering these next 40 years over the next several months. And these recorded times of waiting to enter the promised land and times of wandering, during these, they were, in some ways, they were a result of the lack of faith of God's people. See, God's people always had a trust issue. Do you ever have a trust issue with God? Yeah. And so some of that time of waiting was a result of punishment. But even during that time, God used that time, and that was ordained by God to prepare them for this promise. It was a time where God was working. He was growing them, and he was preparing his people for this amazing plan and purpose he had for them to finally take this promised land that he had given them so they could be a great nation. You see, sometimes, I don't know about you, we want to lead us in his purpose and his plans. And we're like, all right, God, yeah, purpose and plans, I want it now. And sometimes when we see it's not happening in the way maybe we think or in the timing, we may want it to happen. And it doesn't seem like we're getting there. We're looking out the window saying, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Right? And we're not seeing everything fall into place or experiencing what we expect as far as growth with him. We can feel like we're aimlessly wandering, can't we? We feel like, man, God, what are you doing? What am I doing? Am I just putting in time here? Why aren't I doing anything significant? And why aren't you doing anything significant? Why am I just in this holding pattern with you, waiting around with nothing to do? Well, nothing can be further from the truth. You see, I want you to be encouraged this morning because our waiting with God is never wasted. In fact, as we embark on this journey with Israel, walking with God through the wilderness, I want to share with you 3 important truths that are going to guide our journey over the next several months and kind of help introduce this. And we need to keep in mind as we're looking at all of this time of waiting and wandering, these 3 truths hold throughout that time. And I want to share them with you, especially because sometimes we can feel like we're just aimlessly wandering or we're just waiting for God in our daily walk. So here's these 3 truths I want to share with you as we get started this morning. First, God has a plan. God always has a plan. God never goes into something and says, I'll just wing this. You know that? God always has a plan. It is a specific plan and it is a personal plan. Just as God had a plan for Abram and his people, God has a plan for you and me. Not only as individuals, but he has a plan for us. He has a plan for Joy Community Fellowship. Do you know that? And it is a specific plan, and it is a personal plan, and it is a significant plan that he already has for us. It's a plan that he has fashioned for his glory and our benefit. And it's important that we remember that. Especially when we may not see it coming to fruition as quickly or in the way that we think it should be happening. And especially when we look around and we see things looking like they're going in a different direction. And we see everything else around us is trying to convince us otherwise, that maybe God doesn't have a plan. You know, again, we as a church, we're saying we need to find a building, right? What does God have for us? God has a plan. Don't ever doubt that. And don't ever doubt it for your life. In fact, it was like that for God's people, not only when they were in the wilderness, but also when God established them as a great nation. And God established Israel as a great nation. And they eventually had a kingdom, right? And it became a divided kingdom because of disobedience. And they continued to disobey God. And God says, one of the results of disobedience is, I'm going to send you off into captivity. You're going to lose this land for a time. And that's what happened to the Israelite nation. And we talked about that when we looked at Daniel and things like that. Well, another one of God's men who he sent to draw them back to him was a guy named Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is an interesting prophet because he's trying to encourage his people when everything looks like nothing's working out. And he's saying, how can we know this? And you know, God gives them a promise in Jeremiah chapter 29. And this is a promise for the Israelite people. But it also serves to encourage us as well. Because he tells Jeremiah in the midst of their captivity where they don't know that anything's going to work out. God says, I know the plans I have for you. I have plans for you. And they're, declares the Lord, they're plans for wholeness and not for evil. They're plans to give you a future and a hope. Do you know that God has plans? God had plans for Israel. And he's telling Jeremiah, don't despair. I'm here to tell you this morning, God has plans for each and every one of us. Never doubt that and never despair. Believe it and trust it. God's plan is something specific and meaningful and something he desires for each of us personally. And this is to be a source of confidence for us. Yet, you know what? Sometimes when we're waiting or we're wandering, that confidence can waver, can it? Even when we trust that. And that's why it's important that we trust another truth. And here's our second truth. Not only does God have a plan, but God also will accomplish his plan. God has a plan for us, but God always accomplishes his plan. Do you know that? God never fails. Never. There's never a time where God says, hey, I'm 327-1. That's pretty good. No, God is undefeated. He always gets his plan accomplished. So when God sets out to do something, he always does it. It's part of God being holy and perfect. When God sets out to do something, he accomplishes it. Nothing and no one can thwart him or get in his way. Not even us. Do you know that? And we're going to see this with God's people. As they have times of selfishness, as they have times of doubt and times of rebellion, yet God still works his plan in and through them as they wander and as they wait. Now, sometimes in our rebellion, God will accomplish his plan, but it's going to sometimes be more painful for us. Great example, remember when we went through Jonah? God had a great plan for Jonah, and Jonah went the other way. God still accomplished his plan through Jonah, didn't he? But it cost him 3 days in the belly of a great fish, right? God will still do that. And God did that with his people. And we're going to see how God does that with his people. And yeah, it can be more painful sometimes, but God will always accomplish his plan. In fact, this is why Paul, when he's chained in a Roman prison, awaiting his trial where he could face the death penalty, and he writes to one of his churches, the church in Philippi, and he tells them this. He says, I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Christ Jesus. God always accomplishes his plan. And we need to trust that. So as we kind of hit the road on this road trip, we need to know that God has a plan, God has a destination, and God will always get us to that destination. And we can bank on that. But even sometimes that can seem far-fetched, can it? And we can have times where we get down about that. And we have these times of waiting. And this is why I want to share this third and most important truth, especially as we embark on this series. And it's this. Yeah, God has a plan, and God will accomplish his plan. But the best yet is God is faithfully working in between this time. God is always faithfully working in between. The time between when God makes a plan for us and he fulfills it, it's not some empty or wasted time. It's not just sitting there, putting in time. Rather, it's a time when God is working, he's building, he's teaching, he's stretching, and he's readying us for his plans. That's why Paul says in Romans, we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. For those who are called according to his purpose. Even those times of waiting and wandering, God will work together. You see, during these 40 plus years that we're going to cover over the next several months, even though God's people have failure and they have punishment, during that time, God is preparing them. God is giving them everything they need to walk in his plans. Do you know that? During these 40 years, as we're going to see in Leviticus and Numbers and in Deuteronomy, we're going to see how God gives his people his laws for their benefit. Not just laws on how to follow him and obey him, but laws that are given for their good health and for their own sanity. That God sets that up. In fact, some of these laws that he sets up, cleanliness laws, we even keep today. And if we would keep them today, maybe we wouldn't have diarrhea lettuce going on right now. I mean, that's how cool some of what God is giving his people in the wilderness. So God gives his people the laws, not only worshiping him for their health and well-being. He also, you know what he does during those 40 plus years? He teaches his people to fight, which is a skill that, I don't know, somebody who's just making bricks all day might need to know as they're called to go conquer cities in a new land. And during that time, God is giving them what they need to accomplish his plan. He's not only doing that, but he gives them opportunities to trust them, to trust him when it seems like there's no way, to see justice work out when people disobey him and when people obey him. And also to experience his provision where it seems like it's impossible. Do you know during these 40 plus years, while the people are wandering in the wilderness, not a stitch of their clothing gets pulled out. They still have the same clothes. And it says, not a sole of their shoe wore out in 40 years. Just imagine that. I mean, I know I have some old pairs of socks, but to have 40 plus years shoes that don't wear out. Talk about provision. And we're going to discover all these things. How God uses this time. Why? Because God is faithfully working during our journey. During our times where we think we're just waiting and we're wandering, God is working. You see, God is preparing and training and readying his people to realize his plans for them. And you know what? God does that for us. During times where we think God isn't working, when we think there's nothing going on and we're just sitting here, why won't God do it? I see him doing amazing things. God's working in you. God's giving you experiences to go through. He's giving you opportunities to trust him. He's giving you opportunities to know him. Like what happens when we disobey him and we don't trust him. And we get to experience that. And we get to experience his provision. And we get to experience his goodness. And experience his models that we can look to for all of these things during times of waiting and wandering. That's what we get to look at during these next several weeks as we go through this. So I hope you're ready for an inspiring journey and a challenging journey, an encouraging journey through 40 plus years of waiting and wandering. Because as we go through this, it's going to help each of us follow Jesus better. It's going to help us as individuals and as a church as we follow Jesus into our future. So as we close this morning, I want to give you kind of sum up this entire series in kind of one sentence so that we can kind of grasp this. And it's this: our waiting is never wasted because God is always working. Be encouraged in that this morning. Our waiting, our wandering with him, when we think that God is doing nothing, it's never wasted because God is always doing something and he's always readying us. So as we hop in the car, we put on our seatbelts. Now, I don't know about you. I'm going to give my age here. We never wore seatbelts on our road trips. In fact, one trip to Michigan, I drove the whole thing on the top shelf in the back of our sedan, like laying against the window. But we're gonna get our seatbelts on for this, hopefully, and strap in, because this is going to be an exciting time where we watch God's faithfulness to bring his people home and to bring us to where he has for us. You ready to go? Good. Let's pray.